about habitat. So rabbits, obviously that's kind of a big issue. Here's a good example of deer damage versus rabbit damage. Rabbits looks like a 45-degree cut with pruning shears. Little round rabbit pellets. At this time of year, they're eating a lot of woody stuff, so you can pinch them, and it's like almost like sawdust. Yeah, that just gives you scale, right? So, there you go. Yeah, my slide. It's the old slide deal. That's a backwards there. So this is kind of out of focus, but you can tell this was some shrubs here. So this is actually a good way to protect small shrubs. Again, single kind of a thing. You can take fasten down with a couple of garden staples. You know, rabbits, that's probably enough. If you want something a little more permanent, you know, a stake or rebar or something, a couple of zip ties, kind of give a little rigidity, that would work well. As you can see, this one is not protected and that one is not very good, but this one's about 3 times the height of that one. So, not kind of deal there. So this is, again, succulent plants there, but you can see the 45-degree cut. This is also rabbit damage. So in the winter time, like right now, when you get all this snow cover, we're going to start girdling bark on shrubs and trees and things. So that's real common rabbit damage. And there you can see the little rabbit pellets down there. Last year, I know, like on campus, I think that's where I took this picture was. We had a terrible time with rabbits. There were rabbits all over the place, and last winter was rough, and so they really hit it hard. So again, this is kind of along a shed. This is a woven wire, galvanized. It's 1/4 inch. Really all you need is 1 inch squares. It's a little cheaper because it's less material. This is what I had, so this is what I did. Now in a lot of things you'll see where you want to take this down 8 inches at least to maybe 1 foot, and then come out 8 inches to 1 foot, okay, because stuff can dig and things. All right, so I'm the lazy biologist. I went down to ground level, came out, staked it down, and then put gravel over the top. Okay, so if you want to plant something against the structure, you got to have at least 8 inches deep, preferably 1 foot. Okay, that's a lot of work. Okay, that's kind of how it is. Just stapled to the side there. Looks all right, but that'll keep cats out. That'll keep groundhogs out, skunks, rabbits, possum, all those kind of things. Talked about the brush pile. Really got problems. I got rabbits and everything, but I've done other stuff where I just kind of leave the brush piles and it works out fine. But if I really have problems, you can take that out. This is a big production kind of a thing, but the tree tubes, they can be effective at minimizing that girdling I was talking about with rabbits. It works just fine from that standpoint. So again, if you want to protect single trees, particularly thin barked trees, this would be a good way to do it from that standpoint. You may read about natural rabbit control. Certainly there's predators of rabbits. Snakes, that would be for like the little bunnies, not the big rabbits. Okay, we don't have those kinds of snakes here. Don't worry. And then, you know, the weed patches, stone piles, brush piles, anything that would provide cover, you're going to get rid of that from that standpoint. Again, they're a game species, so you need a permit first. Although, you know, if you've got property that's large enough and you're out in the country, you can hunt and things like that. That's fine too. 2 foot to, you know, so 24 to 30 inch fencing is fine with rabbits. Snug to the ground or buried. If you do snug to the ground, you know, using like a J stake or something like that can help kind of secure it to the ground. Most of that rabbit fencing, though, has a pretty heavy gauge wire on the ground. And so you can take that and really kind of work it in the ground before you fix it to the post. That seems to work pretty well. If you're lazy like me, you don't want to bury it. Okay. That works pretty good. There are several repellents labeled for rabbits. Many of them are the same repellents for deer. So a lot of those repellents are labeled for multiple species. There's a lot of species that dig holes, kind of go eat striped skunks. I don't really cover them, don't have any pictures, but you'll find small, like cone-shaped pits in your lawn. That's a skunk's grubbing, so they smell the grub and they kind of get in there and feed on it. Chipmunks, a clean kind of a silver dollar-sized hole. They'll actually carry soil away that they dig out to make the hole less conspicuous. Voles are kind of similar. Sometimes you'll see holes there, but most of theirs is different, and I'll show you those. And voles are even smaller, and you kind of see the difference there. So some of these can be real confusing. Tree squirrels are bigger. This is actually a hole. You'll see this. These are cicada killers in the summertime. They dig those holes. So if you ever see something like this adjacent to patios and concrete and things like that, or foundations, those are actually insects that dig it up. That's not wildlife. Tree squirrels, good tree squirrel habitat. So where you have walnuts, oaks, you're going to have tree squirrels. Okay, gray squirrels, fox squirrels, red squirrels. Types of damage that they do, they will girdle and strip bark on trees. It's unclear why they do this. One theory is that it's a nutritional kind of thing. There's something in there that they like. Other theory is they're doing that to build nests. They really don't know from that standpoint. But it can be quite extensive. This is a cornfield that shows the squirrel digging, but it's just the same thing whether it's in your yard or flower bed or whatever. Good size, 2 to 3 inch size hole. Soil is pulled to one side. They're digging, and so you can see that kind of soil coming out there. Trim branches away from trees. And so if you got squirrels, and I showed you that picture, you want to remove access. That could be really difficult if you got a lot of trees around from that standpoint. But the rule of thumb is you want them 10 feet back from structures, which is quite a long ways from that standpoint. You also want to clean gutters. If you've got trees around that are depositing seeds in those gutters, that's attractive for squirrels. And squirrels will run up and down those gutters, as will possums and other animals feeding on those seeds in your gutters. So clean gutters can help. This is definitely something you don't want. Okay? That's a no-no. Bad site for that tree. That's eastern hemlock. Look how close they planted it. That's a no. That's probably this big when they planted it, but you guys know all that now. Okay, game species. So again, you don't need a permit because now they're under the fur bearer group. So no permit, report in 72 hours. Lots of repellents for tree squirrels. They'll rodents, so they'll chew on gutters, power lines, things like that, and you can prevent access. So from that standpoint, we already talked a little bit about trapping. Chipmunks, cute little buggers there. Problem areas around foundations and things. This is very attractive for chipmunks. Okay, this is actually my house too. And so you see chipmunks going under here. Actually, I was going to repair this, but I actually had some lizards living under there, so I was fine with that, so I left it. So, I'm usually like most people. You let things go until it reaches some kind of a threshold. Very clean little hole there. That's a chipmunk hole, about 1 inch or so wide. Trapping chipmunks. If you do a lethal trap, you can use a rat trap. That's powerful enough for a chipmunk. I wouldn't use that on a tree squirrel. That's not powerful enough. We'd have to use specialized traps. I hate those things. But it works pretty well. This is a special box of probably you mind developed where it's kind of open in the back, but you put that against foundation so the chipmunk's running through there, and the box forces him to go over the trap to get to so you don't get any bait stealers, that kind of thing. This would be an example of a trap designed for a tree squirrel. Okay, I'm not going to set this one. It's a very, very powerful trap. Tree squirrels are very big, powerful animals, so you need a big, powerful trap. The last thing you want to do is try and use a small trap for an animal that's not designed for, because you end up just hurting it, not killing it, and that's not what we want. Again, non-game species, no permit, no report, exclude with the 1/4 inch hardware cloth in some areas. Most of the time, you have problems with chipmunks digging around newly planted seedlings, digging up seeds, digging in flowering pots, although squirrels do that too. And you can trap them with cage traps just fine as well, so little box traps. Typically with rodents, chipmunks, squirrels, things like that, I use some kind of a nut meat, like little sunflower seeds, with just enough peanut butter just so they stick together, not a lot. That works pretty well for a bait for either of those species. There's a lot of little fuzzies out there that look alike. So moles, voles, and shrews. So moles and shrews are meat eaters. Okay, they're closely related. Voles are rodents. They're seed and plant eaters. Okay. This is what moles do. So they make these tunnels. This is kind of a whole mess of tunnels, and you start seeing these little dirt mounds where they're digging their deep burrows and they're pushing that soil up. And so that's kind of what they're doing there. And so you can see this is actually kind of, the grass kind of tends to die sometimes around when you raise that soil, the roots dry out. This is one of those sonic devices, and you see all this activity going on. This was my neighbor. She had all this problems, so she bought one of these things. They don't work, okay? It's just kind of funny. Again, you see those mounds. Typically, you see those mounds most commonly at the end of summer and fall, where they're preparing their overwintering chambers. They spend all winter in there. They don't hibernate, and so they spend those. See, this one's kind of a fresh mound. That's not where you set traps. You want those surface tunnels to set traps. And so this is a surface tunnel, nice round hole, and this is kind of one of those Victor out of sight traps. See, I threw a little mole's head caught in there. So yeah, there's all sorts of different mole traps out there. Probably for the last 5 years or so, I've been using these traps. They're called no mole traps. It's just a single spring trap that you compress. Stick the little trigger in there. It's kind of rounded. Okay, I put it back too far. About right there. Okay, so you want these. You put them in the tunnel on either end. Okay, so Mr. Mole comes or Mrs. Mole comes, and hits that, and they'll push at it. They're trying to push through. I wonder why.
No wonder you don't catch 2 minutes.
The idea is they knock it. I didn't set that right. So it's got a rounded end, and so it's one of those things where you want it to where it's fairly sensitive, but you don't want it too sensitive because every time you put it in there, and it does that when you're trying to put it in the hole. So it's a little trial and error. And I use these to kind of back to back. That's what I do it with. They give you little wooden stakes, but old gutter spikes and things like that work pretty well. I don't know. I guess I'm done.
What's that trap called?
No mole. So like you use them in pairs. You know what? I wonder if I push the black button there. Is there a black screen on this?
You might be able to just move the mouse on the computer.
Usually don't do that when they're doing a slideshow.
Didn't pay the electric bill.
Oh, yeah, she's not here. She told me she might step out. It's been fun. Worked pretty good. You know, in terms of trapping, you know, they sell them in pairs. The more traps you have, the better. 'Cause you always ask like where to set the trap. And some things you'll read where it says, well, you know, the damage looks like a big wagon wheel, so you do that. Some of the tunnels they make are just kind of exploratory. Some of them are more permanent, where they can kind of move back from feeding areas to resting areas, those types of things. It went black. I just kind of, what I do is I just start setting traps. And if I got a couple other sites where I think they might be active, I'll compress the soil to step on it, and I'll mark it with a pin flag or something like that. So if the sites that I pick with my traps aren't working, I'll go back and set on those sites where I have activity. Okay? When you set these though, I let them set for 2 or 3 days. I don't mess with them. Just let them go. Because sometimes moles are funny. They just, either they kind of hang out for a while and don't do much, or they're doing something else. I don't know. They're underground. They mostly eat earthworms and soft-bodied insects. Yeah. Yeah, moles don't eat plants, okay? But the moles like the mole tunnels, so they can use them, right? So sometimes you'll have mole tunnels in your bed, and then you'll have damage, and you think, well, that's the moles doing it, when it's actually the voles that are doing it. Okay, that's a very good question.
Shrews also eat earthworms and...
Shrews actually will eat mice and other things as well, so they're much more carnivorous in nature. Yeah, yeah, isn't that crazy? They're mean little buggers.
So the catch all three things?
I've only caught, no, because the mole is actually a pretty beefy, I mean, you can see this trap, so that mole is like that big and they're pretty thick, and so they're tunneling, pushing through there, and so they're constantly having to repair their tunnels, and they'll just think this is something in their way, and they'll try and push it through, okay, that's what happens, yes?
So that's what, some of the reading is confusing because it says that they're not going after your vegetables.
That's right.
But if you've got good earthworms and
Oh,
stuff,
yeah,
then, because I would
absolutely.
plant a nice row of whatever, and then he'd go right along there. And so it was very confusing on what it was, but we pitchforked him and it was a mole, so it was not a mole. And I tried those fabulous Victory, what do you call
Victor, yeah.
harpoon things,
Yeah, I don't like the harpoon ones. The
No,
Victor out of sight
They're too
ones.
smart. They're like, I'm not going there, I'll just dig a new spot.
Yeah.
You gotta catch them in the act.
Sometimes you do. You see that tunnel going, and you can actually take a shovel and just scoop them out and give them a whopping.
Oh, your neighbor over
Like even with these traps, though, you can imagine like sometimes you want the traps in the relatively straight tunnels, and sometimes it's hard to find. Sometimes they just don't make them, so you just got to make do. With the idea is they tend to move quicker along those straight tunnels, right? So you kind of want them running into it. But sometimes what happens, and so you can imagine you set this on there, and instead of having the stick on this part of the loop, you have it here. So when they hit that trap, it moves, and you can get a denial, and they'll go around it. They'll say something's not right here, and they'll tunnel around it. And so sometimes that happens. With the harpoon trap and that Victor out of sight trap, you've actually kind of got to create a mound where the trigger is, but you've also got to compress the tunnel on either side of it. And so there's more work, more excavation, that kind of a thing. The thing I like about these is you're actually sticking it in the tunnel. Sometimes you have to maybe take the end of your trowel and just kind of ream the tunnel a little bit to get it to where it's wide enough to go in there, but usually that's not a problem. The biggest thing you have with this is sometimes it gets hung up on roots down underneath there. So, it's definitely a trick to it. Just me
I was going
kind of
out-
giving you a couple tips standing here, you're probably going to still have some trial in there.
I was going out and compressing the tunnels, so I was catching all the new activity. I mean, he dug up my garden.
It's tough, and
All over.
a lot of times you'll get them where they're under a bed of like ivy or something like that, and maybe it's hard to even find the tunnels. It can be a real mess, there's no doubt about it. Some places you got so many that you're almost better just rolling the lawn and resetting it, and then where they start popping up is then set your traps there, because you might have so many tunnels, it's like, man, you know, they've got so many ways to go, it's almost like they're avoiding your traps or something, but even though it's probably not the case. So, moles are tricky, no doubt about it. There you go. See, so you take a little wild bunch of sod there, but I don't do that too much because I don't want to kind of interfere with the workings of the spring. So you kind of see how that works from that standpoint. And really, you got just a big enough hole to where you can get this trap kind of slide down in there. So you just need a little bit of area to work from that standpoint. I like these too because you don't have to worry about a mower hitting a big metal trap and that kind of deal. So if you got someone else that mows your lawn, you know, you might. I'll take a pin flag where I put them, and that's about it.
Well, how do you know when a mole's on?
You don't. You got to dig them up and check. That's the downside. But it's not that big a deal. You just remove this sod, and so you can see by looking at this, okay, where if it's compressed, it's going to have a different kind of a shape to it. So a lot of times you can just see. Okay, but you can see if it's compressed, it's going to be narrower, right? And so you can just tell by looking at it after if you do it enough. But if you're like me, you always want to just pull it out, see?
You always set 2 inches.
Back to back, absolutely. Yep. No doubt about it. Yep. So they're sold in pairs, obviously. Yep. You'll see stuff about mold barriers, underground walls and stuff. Man, that seems like a lot of work. Repellents. There's also poison toxicants, baits. Not a lot of research into any of those. Okay, trapping is kind of really probably the most effective. And the thing I don't like about that stuff, and again, part of it's just with moles, is that you do that kind of stuff, and then you wonder if they worked or not, or maybe you got new moles and it killed the old moles, or what happened. But at least you got something in a trap, you know if you got it or not. So I really like that a lot better, just personally. But those are options that you can use as well. Let's talk about voles real quick. A lot of different species of voles. These are the runways, surface runways that you get in lawns. So again, where you get that damage is now where you've got snow cover. They're in your lawn now because they've got overhead protection. And sometimes you'll see these little grass nests that they make in there. You'll see droppings in there that look a lot like mouse droppings. Those are from voles. Voles can girdle plants, woody stuff. This is from pine voles. Pine voles spend a lot more time underground and they'll chew on roots and things like that. That's pretty typical. This schematic kind of shows like the little gnawing marks that you get on the woody stuff. And this is a good slide of damage to hostas, where the vole was there kind of digging up a little bit, eating down there close to the ground, and just kind of doing damage to that plant. This is kind of kind of a stage kind of a thing, but you get the idea. You can exclude voles from things just as you can rabbits and things like that, but it's got to be a smaller mesh. Okay, so that woven wire kind of rabbit fence, you don't want to exclude voles. And so what you can do, if you've got that for rabbits, you can double up with something smaller like that to exclude the voles from that standpoint. I'm going to skip that right now, and I'm going to skip this because we're running out of time. You can trap them though, so you can trap voles with mouse traps, okay? Some people will actually cover them. This is actually a cover design for vole traps, where you put 4 to 6 mouse traps underneath that. Again, you put it where you're having damage. A lot of times it's within ground cover and other things that provide them cover. That's a pretty good thing you can do for voles. Again, eliminate weeds, ground cover, litter. The problem is we want all that stuff, right? So that's kind of a conflict. But the thing you can do with voles is reduce the mulch layer. So if you've got, remove all mulch within a few inches of that stem, okay? And then have mulch about 1 to 2 inch layer, no more. Okay, that would be okay. That's better than having 4 inches or whatever. And that can help as well. There are toxicants for voles. You might have seen these little fake rock things like this. Okay, these are for voles. Okay, where you put the poison bait in there, it's staked to the ground, it's locked, and so other animals can't get in there and they go in those holes and eat it. Okay, that's typically more of a winter kind of treatment that some people do for voles, not necessarily a summer. Vole populations are weird. They're kind of cycled. You get 1 year you got a bunch, and the next couple of years you don't have much, and that's pretty typical of several species of wildlife. Woodpeckers, several species of woodpeckers, they peck holes. They're drumming for mates. They're looking for food. They're excavating nesting structures. Typically with houses, it's drumming. Okay, 9 times out of 10, it's drumming. You do get yellow-bellied sapsuckers, which we don't have year-round. They're migratory. They're just passing through, and they peck holes in the bark of trees and they lick the sap out. And so, while it's unsightly, that amount of damage on that tree is not quite that big a deal. That tree's going to overcome that. There's really not much you can do to help that tree out after the damage is done. There's really not much you can do to prevent this. Okay, that's just kind of the way it goes. This is actually damage from pileated woodpeckers. You can see all this kind of stuff down there. That's from an excavation from that. That's actually a dead tree, so it's already dead. Now, if that was a live tree, that tree wouldn't do too well from that. This is that mylar tape. Again, woodpeckers are very visual. A lot of times where the damage occurs, it's underneath the soffit, or it's at the peak of a house, like an A-frame style house, that kind of thing. So you hang the mylar tape. It's supposed to scare them, that kind of a thing. Again, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. You do need a permit. They're covered under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. You can actually exclude them. So some things you might see where they'll have bird netting or something like that. Big hassle, big expense. I mean, geez. I mean, that's who wants that kind of on their house kind of deal. And so, but you do find that in publications and things that you see on the internet. Probably the best thing you can do is spray them with a water hose, sound makers, the mylar tape, this crazy spider. There's other things that they make, you know, that you can kind of hang kind of on the soffit underneath there. This is on a swivel. It has these tabs so the wind catches it and it spins. It catches the light. Kind of looks pretty cool. It's almost like a little
CDs.
There you go. Well, yeah, that would work well. A lot cheaper than that thing. So, you know, again, you kind of get the idea, but just putting up one of those, it's not going to do it. You're going to have to do a number of different things, right? I think that's clear. Snakes, I put in here because people always have questions about snakes. What's venomous? What's non-venomous? Okay, all of our snakes in Indiana that are venomous are pit vipers, cat-like pupil when at rest. Heat-sensing pit below the nostril and the eye on each side of the head. Have a spade, kind of broad head when at rest relative to the neck. Although if you don't look at a lot of snakes, people could get confused very easily. Okay? Big round eye, nostril, no pit. Okay, that's a harmless snake. That's a racer. Okay? Spade-shaped head, kind of, that's non-venomous though. Okay, snakes can be tricky. Okay, that's a hognose. He's ticked off, threatened himself like that. Okay, kind of a spade-shaped head. That's non-venomous. Okay, that's a water snake. Water snakes flatten their body when they're ticked off. Okay, People probably look at that and think it's what? Copperhead? Okay, no, it's a water snake. Okay? So there are a lot of snakes can kind of give that appearance, okay? Cat-like pupil, nostril, or the pit, those are four things, but you kind of got to get fairly close to it. And again, if you look at snakes a lot, you'll pick those things out pretty easy. This is a timber rattlesnake. Don't pay attention to the white. Okay, I used to do research with rattlesnakes, and we paint the base tail rattle white so we know we handled it, marked it, and don't need to handle it again. But you can see how broad that head is relative to the little skinny neck. Okay, so that's a timber rattlesnake. That's a copperhead. Okay, saddle-shaped markings. Okay, cat-like pupil, heat-sensing pit, nostril. Okay, what about that one?
King snake, isn't it?
No, you're close though. This is a milk snake.
It's a snake.
Eastern milk snake, or Wyandotte. Okay. Head and neck pretty similar there, that's round. That's a cottonmouth, big fat body, gaping, okay? So the thing you can't tell from books a lot of times is the behavior. Okay, so the way the body position is on these things, their behavior, same with rattlesnakes, it's much more easy to kind of tell them apart, but that's a cottonmouth. What can you do about snakes? They do make these kind of cardboard traps now that have glue strips in them. So they're really good for inside structures, okay? When you start using them outside structures, yeah, you can catch snakes, you can catch all sorts of stuff out there, okay? And some of that stuff you just don't want to catch. This pool, I love this. I got this off of their company bases. I think I just let whatever swimming around in there swim around. Oh, whatever. From that standpoint. So the idea is you get them on there, you pour mineral oil or vegetable oil on them, and they come off of that glue, supposedly, from that standpoint. Oh, I forgot about this. Also on that website, this is what they show you. Oh, I don't have it on. They show like just taking that trap and just like throwing it in the trash. So you can let it go. It's fine.
Well, and if we do snake ID, I get people that come in, please don't bring me the live snake. I've had it happen one time, and the snake was found in this building. So bring me pictures, not the real thing, because then I have to try to get right.
I get pictures all the time. You know, is it venomous, that kind of thing. One time was it a venomous snake, 16 years ago. So it can't happen, especially down here. You know, you will have copperheads, that kind of a thing. So it is possible. Talk a little bit about raccoons. Digging up turf in the late summer for grubs, okay? Skunks, little tiny precision holes. Raccoons, they just tear it up. They go after it, okay? That's pretty common. This is raccoon damage to melons. They dig in there and they'll clean that sucker out, okay? So that's actually from raccoons. This is damage to corn, masticated cob, shredded husk, okay? They'll climb up on the stalks. This is all corn damage. This is obviously field corn, but that's all raccoon. And you can see the little claw marks climbing up the stalks to get the stuff. And their weight, they'll pull the stalk down, and that's why you get that. So pretty dramatic. There's all sorts of ways. I took this picture. I was at a property, and they were trying to take control of their raccoons. This is the same place I took that picture of that nasty structure in the beginning. Okay, this is a Connor bear kill trap here. Put the bait behind there. It's okay, but you know, if you've got cats and dogs and things that you don't want to catch, you got no control what's going in there. Okay, so I don't promote this kind of thing unless you know what you're doing. All right, because there's ways to exclude non-targets and things like that. So that's the reason why I threw that in there. They actually do make traps that are specific to raccoons that you kind of have to stick their paw down the hole to get it. Where dogs and cats don't do that, raccoons, they always are kind of doing that kind of behavior. So you can really be quite specific about catching a raccoon.
We want to turn out you'd have to shoot.
So remember, they're a fur bearer group, the chimney caps. Probably the biggest thing people have with them is garbage and also feeding them, which is kind of a no-no.
Oh.
And the last species is the groundhog.
It's
We've already
Chuck.
talked about that. Probably one of the biggest problems they have is with structures and digging in barns and things like that, or outside of sheds. And so again, that's that Connor bear trap in that hole. This is much more selective with the groundhog. If I wanted to make sure I'm only catching the groundhog, I can stake down a piece of plywood over this, and I know that's all I'm going to get. Okay, so there are ways of doing that. Again, really not appropriate for this class, and and from a time standpoint. You can actually exclude groundhogs and raccoons with electric fence, okay? So if you've got issues with the garden, one strand 6 inches above ground, a second strand 12 inches above ground, you can prevent both of those. Because they're actually pretty good climbers, okay, groundhogs are. They'll climb up into trees when they're threatened by predators and they're not close to their burrow. There is a site in Indiana, the wildlifehotline.info site. It used to have a toll-free hotline you can call for information, but funding went, but they kept the URL, so that's the site. It's a partnership among Purdue, the DNR, and the USDA Wildlife Services. But they've got information in terms of identification and control of wildlife, find a professional, both a nuisance wildlife control operator and a rehabber, and then other resources right there. There's also a national website, the Internet Center for Wildlife Damage Management. I guess I didn't put the URL on it. Oh yeah, I did. The icwdm.org. So good information on there as well. So that's it, and I think we best be moving on. Any questions about wildlife damage that I didn't cover? Because I got a lot, I know, during the break.
Groundhog stay in one spot.
They do stay in one spot, and so you know, you can use those gas cartridges on them too, but you got to be careful about doing that around structures because they're lighting something on fire and sticking in the ground. The other thing that can happen too is they plug. They'll take dirt and they'll plug their chamber every night, and so a lot of times you put those in there and it won't have an effect because they actually plug themselves out of that. If that makes sense. So, but they're easy to track.
I've had one for years, but it doesn't seem to do anything.
Yeah, I see one in my backyard all the time. It doesn't bother me. I don't bother him or her. But, you know, they cross that line, you know, we've got subdivisions. So that's the thing, you know, I mean, I got into this business because I like wildlife. It's not because I don't. But I think everyone's got their own kind of action thresholds and what they're willing to tolerate and what they're not willing to tolerate. And that's really kind of an individual decision. Oh, I don't want that. Okay, let's talk about the good stuff. All right. So a lot of different species that you can manage for in your yard with relatively small acreages. Some of them have large home ranges, some of them have very small home ranges. But if you got the yard, that you got the habitat thing, that regardless of the size of area that they use, whether it's big or small, you can have them visit your yard and use it. I think a lot of people like that. So, but you still want to look at the big picture. So what you have around you is really important in terms of what you can attract on your property. Some of it you know based on what you've seen, right? You've observed wildlife, that kind of thing, so that kind of helps kind of understand what you can and can't do. But what you have around you is really important, okay? This is my house. This is now a subdivision, okay? But that's my house. Because I'm in close proximity to this park, I get a lot of different things on there that maybe otherwise I wouldn't, okay? So I get owls, Cooper's hawks, fox, coyote, skunk, you know, all these different things, deer, a lot of different songbirds, particularly during migratory season, because, you know, partly because of what we have around us and what I have on my property, but a big part of it plays into those big green spaces and things like that. Being down in this part of the state, you're close to a major river. A lot of species, migratory birds, use those as kind of highways and things to guide them. So because of that, you've got a high potential for different species of wildlife. And down here, there's different species that we don't have anywhere else in the state. You know, Allegheny wood rat, some of those other things, green salamanders. So it's kind of a neat area. So the trick is with your yard, though, if you're kind of landscaping for wildlife, you kind of got to make it look good. Okay, so that's kind of beyond my skill, so to speak. Okay, I'm pretty good at telling my wife what looks good and what doesn't look good, but I have a hard time telling her, you know, how to plant it, if that makes sense. Okay, I can look at a yard and think, I like how that looks, and I can look at a yard and say, I don't like how that looks. I couldn't tell you why, if that makes sense. Okay, but even so, a lot of the concepts that we would use if I'm trying to manage wildlife on a 40-acre property as opposed to a quarter-acre property are going to be the same. Okay. What to plant is important, okay? Diversity, height, structure, fruiting, blooming, phenology, when it does that, those are really important things. From a yard standpoint, I think the best way I can describe that is think about you have trees, shrubs, forests, okay? And then you have trees that produce soft fruit, trees that produce nuts, shrubs that produce fruit, shrubs that maybe are more for cover. Some shrubs actually produce nuts. For flowers, you think of especially like fruiting and timing of flowering throughout the year, so you have different things throughout the year. Well, that's important for some things like hummingbirds and butterflies and things like that. And so what you plant is important. The best thing I can give an example is from forest wildlife. And so if I'm talking to a group of woodland owners, I'm talking about forest plant succession where you have early successional habitats, and without disturbance, you eventually get a forest, okay? And it's not that one of these is better than the other, but you need this diversity of structure to get all the kind of diversity of wildlife that you can get, if that makes sense, okay? So some things really like the grass and forby habitat, other things like the mature trees, other things are very generalistic and like a lot of different things, okay? If you don't do anything in your yard, you're gonna have robins and cardinals and things like that. They're habitat generalists, okay? But you're not gonna maybe get some other things. And so that's kind of an example I can give you. There's a lot of fruiting trees that provide food for wildlife. Again, we tend to think of food as kind of an important thing from our standpoint, but there are other aspects. Hackberry, sassafras, wild apple, wild plum, all these different things, black gum. But some of these things can produce good foliage, good color, okay? Sassafras is one of those things where I think it's a very underutilized tree in landscaping, okay? It's got really nice growth form, really good color, and it provides a nice food value for wildlife. Flowering dogwood, of course, everyone's familiar with. Even things like sumac, okay, can be a nice wildlife thing. Clumps of sumac, really valuable for birds during the summer, but also it's kind of a starvation food, you would say, for some species this time of year when other things aren't available. So even less desired kind of plants have a role in wildlife. There's another kind of look at all the fruiting bodies on that sassafras there. Birds like that kind of thing. A lot of trees that produce hard mass, nuts. So oaks, you have the kind of the white oak group and the red oak group, but then you also have oaks that produce small acorns and ones that produce big. And so that's going to kind of select what can eat it. And so small things like pin oak and shingle oak are more readily available to smaller birds, where things like red oak and some of those big, large oaks are more eaten by deer, okay, and turkey and those kinds of things. Black walnut is a highly preferred nut for tree squirrels, for example. American beech produces a good crop of nuts that a lot of species prefer. So again, maybe not one of these is better than the other, but it's good to have diversity. And certainly when you look at most yards, kind of nut trees are a limiting factor, okay? And so that's kind of an important thing. With any of this stuff, the big open grown form is you're going to get more mass production. So in a woodland, you know, this is an important oak tree because it's got such a big crown, it's going to produce a lot of acorns. Well, in a yard situation, most of our trees are this kind of a growth form. So just having one or two oaks in a yard can make a huge difference, okay, from that standpoint. The other thing I would point out with this kind of a growth form is you got all these large lateral branches. And so for things like hawks and owls and some of those things, very nice for roosting and nest sites and those kinds of things. You also get little birds nesting in there. So this is a hummingbird nest. You ever seen a hummingbird nest? But they'll nest in yard trees, but they're typically kind of a woodland species. So you know, trees are important for nest sites as well.
What do they make that out of?
The outside stuff is lichen, so they'll pick a lichen off the outside bark of trees. The inside stuff, I'm not sure. I'd have to look it up in a book, to be honest with you. There's actually a Peterson's Field Guide for nests, and it talks about the size of them, what they're made of, that kind of thing. So I mentioned, you know, trees are important for larger birds as well. That's a Cooper's hawk. Vines, okay, so vines are good for wildlife, okay? It's not something we really think about in a yard tree, and so this would be more for kind of the edge of the property if you're kind of maybe in a more rural area. I've got a couple vines on some trees between me and the neighbor. You know, they're okay where they're at. I wouldn't want them in the middle of the yard, but for things like tree squirrels, catbirds, really, really good, red fox, gray fox, those are really fruit-producing species. A lot of shrubs that are valuable for wildlife. The problem with shrubs is a lot of the ones we have are invasive. So this is all bush honeysuckle. Okay, when I first bought my house, I had this monster bush honeysuckle here that I finally got rid of. But it produces a lot of fruit, kind of nice flowers, so that's why people like it. But it's really invasive and it's kind of taken over some of our native woodlands and things. And so, unfortunately, the reason why we have a lot of those problems are because we planted them. There are a lot of native alternatives, and I'm going to kind of go through some of these because I think it's important. Winterberry is one. It's got almost kind of a similar kind of a form and color, I think, as the bush honeysuckle, but it's a native species. Birds really love these things, especially cedar waxwings when they're coming back. This is one of those shrubs that has fruit for a long period of time. You think, well, nothing eats it. It's not very good for wildlife. But because it retains that fruit for so long, when the early spring migrants come in, it's a really important food source. Eastern burning bush. This is the native version of the burning bush that's sold pretty much everywhere else. Looks just about exactly the same. Why didn't they just cultivate this as opposed to the other one? I don't know. Roughleaf dogwood. There's a lot of species of dogwood. Silky dogwood, red osier dogwood. Really good fruit producing species. Songbirds love these things. I never had catbirds in my yard until I had a couple of these producing fruit. Okay, then all of a sudden I had catbirds and some of those other species. So really valuable. So they're silky. So very similar in appearance, has a different color of fruit, but nice flowers, very fragrant from that standpoint. The problem you're going to have with dogwoods is that they root sucker, and so the good part is if you don't mind them spreading, you just let them go. The bad part is if you mind them spreading, you got to kind of cut those and kind of manage them from that standpoint. You can spray Roundup, a glyphosate herbicide on those, and it'll kill it back, but you're not going to affect the main tree, if that makes sense. Okay. So there are ways to kind of manage that. Coralberry is another one. It's a kind of a small shrub, but it produces a bright pink fruit that wildlife eat. Very beautiful plant from that standpoint. A lot of our viburnums are really good for wildlife. Maple leaf viburnum, nannyberry is a viburnum. They've all got that kind of viburnum-shaped bud. Black haw is another one. You can see they're all very similar from that standpoint in arrowwood. Okay, kind of big, bright white flower clusters. A lot of fruit production on them, and a lot of them have nice fall color as well. So a lot of our native shrubs have that. That's an arrowwood shrub right there. So a lot of options from that standpoint. Another vine I didn't mention before. This is Virginia creeper. Okay, different than the grapevine that kind of hangs. It's big and woody. This is kind of more of a vine you see along fence rows and trees and things like that. But really good for wildlife. Produces a fruit. Okay, poison ivy is even good for wildlife, believe it or not. A lot of animals like to eat the fruit. Rabbits and deer will browse the woody part of it. I'm not suggesting that's what you plant in your yard, but I'm just kind of giving you the information. Okay. A lot of kind of native kind of stuff. Blackberry, black raspberry. Sometimes people plant these because they're interested in the fruit production, particularly blackberry for wine or for jelly or those kinds of things. My father-in-law has a bunch of blackberry vines in his yard because he makes wine out of them. So just something, but again, his problem is he's trying to keep the animals off of them because they are so valuable. You need to have some type of a legume or four component in your property. And so this is clover and grass right here. And so a lot of kind of the standard lawn applications, you want to minimize this for most people. But from a wildlife standpoint, that's really, really beneficial. Rabbits certainly like to feed on that. Deer certainly would as well. But along with those is insects and those arthropods and things like that you and I probably really don't give much thought about. But very, very important to have a diversity of these things on your property for wildlife. Okay? All the birds, the baby birds, the young get fed insects because it's a good protein source. And so that's important for muscle development and growth. And so having that's important. The way we provide that, hummingbirds also, I forgot, adults eat up to 2,000 insects per day. Okay, so nectar really isn't a good source of protein. It's all sugar, carbohydrates, right? And so that's where they get their insects. And so that's important. Where we get that kind of structure in a yard is with flower or forb gardens, flower gardens, right? You get that diversity. The thing is, you know, you gotta minimize your use of insecticides, otherwise you lose that benefit. But you can still provide some of that in your yard. Is it gonna be like this? No, but it's gonna be something, and something's better than nothing. Yes?
Does food coloring hurt hummingbirds, and can we make our own?
You don't
safe?
need it. You don't need, like hummingbird feeders will have generally a colored red to it, right? And so you don't need the food coloring. If you just got a glass jar, okay, but they're not really, but are the flowers,
Red.
you know, they're red, that's all you need then. You really don't need the food coloring. I'm not sure if that's bad for hummingbirds. I know like honey and some of the additives people put in there, it's definitely bad. You don't want that. Just sugar and water, that's all you need. Yep, that's a good question.
What ratio of sugar and water?
4 to 1. Yep, so you boil it for a couple of minutes, you get all the stuff in there that you don't want, cleans it out, then just let it cool and refrigerate it. And you can put that feeder, you know, it depends, when it's cooler out, if the feeder's not in the sun, it'll last longer. You know, early in the spring, you probably get away with almost a week or so in there. That's probably pushing it though.
Hot
When it's
summer.
really hot, you know, every couple of days, you're probably gonna have to change it out. Okay? So.
And what is, do they, when you have lots of ants on your hummingbird feeder, are they eat, and do they eat some of the ants, or do they eat them?
I suppose they would eat some of the ants, yeah. I mean, I don't see why they wouldn't, from that standpoint, but a lot of times people don't want the ants on there because they're stealing the stuff, you know. So a lot of those traps have like little ant boats and, yeah, exactly. I get some of those in mine, not a lot, but I know some people have problems with them. From that
What other
standpoint.
insects, or what kind of insects are they, do they eat?
Well, I couldn't tell you.
Lots, I mean, just anything, mosquitoes?
You know, if you think about though, they're small, so they're probably eating small insects, and the way, you know, bats, for example, they talk about bats eating mosquitoes. Well, bats really don't eat mosquitoes because mosquitoes aren't flying around like moths and beetles are. So that's primarily what they're eating. Hummingbirds, I'm not so sure. I'm not sure if the insects that they eat are more off of plants or if they're just kind of catching them in the air. I'm not sure. That's a good question. I never really gave it much thought, to be honest with you. So. Always, never fails. I always have questions I can't answer. That's because you're thinking different than, sometimes I'm too close to it where I just don't think about that stuff. So that's a good point. Another thing, I saw that picture of that native prairie dart. That's great for insect production. That's probably primo if you're really kind of good to get into it from that standpoint. And you know, more of our native prairies really don't have a lot of flowers in them, but that's okay if you do it in your yard and put more flowers and things in them. That's perfectly fine. I think it looks better myself. So really nice. Yes.
So I have a back field that
Yes.
grows up, and but there's a local farmer that comes and mows it
Yep.
for his cows.
Yep.
If I plant or throw some seeds out for like wildflowers, is there a chance it could hurt the cattle? I don't know if that's a silly question or not. I don't know what would hurt.
I know the problem with cattle you get with like a wilting cherry, you know, like leaves from cherry that's dead, it produces a toxin, and so there's some things like that. But now, like from wildflowers, I'm not aware of anything that would do that. The thing is, I don't know if it would grow. So it's like a pasture, right? So it's like
Yeah.
fescue.
Oh, I don't know.
So in order for those things to grow, you need bare soil.
Right.
Okay, so if you don't have bare soil, you're just kind of probably wasting your
Well,
money.
no, I would prepare the soil or whatever, but I didn't want to
Uh-huh.
waste my time preparing the soil for, wildflowers if it's not good for the cows that are going to be eating it at the end of the season.
Ask the farmer.
It
It's a good
depends on
idea.
what the flowers are,
Yeah.
so.
Yeah, I'm sure, I'm not like that's kind of out of my area of expertise,
All right.
but that's good you're thinking that way. What are?
Google it. We said Google it. Wallflowers are toxic. Online.
Yeah, you might be better off just whatever the list is on the thing, is maybe email it to
Yep, email it to me.
Gina, and if she doesn't know, we got people on campus in animal sciences that probably would do it. Yeah. Flower heads and things, okay, so birds are eating the seeds out of those, but we always tell folks to kind of leave those, even if it's in your bed. Okay, I'm always fighting my wife on this. She always wants to get rid of it. As soon as they're like this, she wants to cut them down. I'm like, no. Okay, because you'll have butterfly larvae and eggs that overwinter in these kinds of structures. okay? So you want to leave them up as long as possible. From that standpoint, it's a purple coneflower.
You cut
from that
them and
standpoint.
just put them somewhere? Doesn't.
You know, I don't know if you cut them and you kind of do it, or if they get too wet, or I don't know. That's a good question, but it's probably better to leave them up. But I guess if you don't want to do that, that'd probably be the next best thing.
So all that deadheading conversations we've had all till now, like, don't do it. If you actually want to have any birds, any butterflies, anything, if you want to have a super clean cut garden, do it. Otherwise, leave them.
Right. So remember, everything I say has to do with wildlife, and nothing has to do with the horticultural science of it and everything.
So
So
this
there
comes
could
to
be
where we're
conflicts with
showing-
things I say with other speakers.
Yeah, this is where we tell you guys, we're gonna show you multiple aspects of it. This is one of those examples. Yes, you would deadhead if you're gonna be on a garden walk or whatever. You don't want a single deadhead in there unless you're advertising that garden as a wildlife habitat per se. But you can always still leave a few out and not clear off that whole plant.
So is that just an aesthetic thing then?
Yeah, it's
Okay.
aesthetics only, to deadhead. And to
Right.
encourage, you can re-encourage flowering, because you're not putting energy into seed making.
Gotcha. I mean, these are purple coneflower. I've never had an issue with it, but I mean, there's a lot of flowers there, but maybe there'd be more if I did do that. I don't know. But, yeah, okay. Yep. Obviously, flowers are important to butterflies and things, and for butterflies, you know, nectar's nectar. It's not an issue from that standpoint. Where they're really specific is with the caterpillars. And so some species are very specific, you know, like monarchs are to milkweed, that kind of a thing. But you know, cabbage plants, milkweed, dill, parsley, cherry, hackberry, and some willows are kind of the major groups and species for butterflies. Okay, so we normally don't think of trees as being important butterfly species, but they can be. You know, it's like Ohio buckeye is actually good, and tulip are good for hummingbirds. You know, so from that standpoint. You can feed birds. Obviously, you're kind of providing that seed kind of a thing. You know, different species feed in different ways. You've got ground feeders. You've got birds that like to feed up above ground, those kinds of things. Generally speaking, when you're feeding birds, it's better to have, instead of just a mix of a bunch of stuff, to separate it out so you have one type of food in one type of food in the other. You know, that's from that standpoint. Really what you're replicating a lot of times is this kind of situation. That's actually a food plot and a buffer, but this is a disked area. And so when you disturb the soil, you get a lot of annuals. Annuals produce a lot of seeds. And so in yards, we don't really have this, okay? And so providing that supplemental feed through bird feeding is okay, even though we all say we shouldn't feed any other wildlife. So bird feeding is okay for some reason, but I do it, a lot of people do it. You get enjoyment out of it. You're not hurting anything. As long as the feeders are clean, that kind of a thing, then I guess you're all right. Black oil sunflower is probably #1. Then peanut kernels is #2. White proso millet, stuff that has that in there, that's actually attractive to some of those species like starlings and sparrows that you don't want. And so you may not want to do that. Suet and suet cakes are great, but again, some things like that you may want to attract. Probably the best thing I've seen for those is having it on those feeders that hang upside down, where the axis is on the bottom,